Hello and welcome back to the course Private Pilot Maneuvers. Today we'll talk about something very essential, and that's the effects of flight controls. Now, the flight controls we have on our airplane are the ailerons, elevator, and rudder. And then what I would like to call secondary flight controls, the flaps and the trim. Now, all those controls are used to, maneuver the airplane on the ground and in the air. And any movement or, any operation of the controls always produce the same result in reference to the pilot. So in reference to me, pulling up or pulling back on the yoke and deflecting the elevator upwards will make the airplane, from my viewpoint, go up, and so on. However, this is not necessarily true in relation to, the surrounding world, or the Earth, if you will. Well, let's just have a look at a extreme example. You can't really say that pulling back on the yoke always makes an airplane go up, or the elevator always makes the airplane go up if it's deflected upwards. Because, now think of an aerobatic plane or any airplane, for that matter, if it's going upside down. Now, if you now pull back on the yoke, the airplane will actually descend. But in reference to you, who is now also upside down, it's doing the same thing as it would if you're in normal flight. Now, if you, let's just have a brief look at what the controls actually do. If you move the ailerons, so you move the control column or the stick left or right, you actually move the ailerons out here. And if you move the yoke or column left or right, then one aileron will deflect upwards and one will deflect downwards. Something you should hear about in theory, aerodynamics of flight. However, this will increase lift on one wing, decrease it on the other, and one wing will go up, the other will go down, and you're in a turn. Well, not necessarily in a turn. Normally you are then in a turn. We'll talk about that later. But one wing will drop, will be lower than the other. This movement is called roll around the longitudinal axis. If you pull back or push forward on the yoke or the stick, you'll actually deflect the elevator here at the in the tailplane. If you pull back, the elevator will move up. If you push forward, the elevator will move down. For example, if the elevator moves down, then the entire tailplane will generate more lift. It will move up, and the nose of the airplane will go down. So you have a movement around the lateral axis. And then you have the rudder, operated by the pedals. Now pushing the left pedal will deflect the rudder to the left and vice versa. And this, you can think of that as a 90-degree turned elevator. So by deflecting the rudder, actually you will have sideways lift, so to speak, of the rudder, and this will pull the tail to left or right, and there we're also, of course, pushing the nose left or right in the opposite direction. So if the tail goes right, the nose goes left, and this will rotate the airplane around its yaw axis. So this is what the controls actually do. It's actually too simplified to say the elevator makes the airplane go up and down. But it's more correct to say, well, the elevator moves the airplane around rotates it around its lateral axis, the ailerons around its longitudinal axis, and the rudder around its yaw axis. Now, to smoothly control an airplane, it's not that important how much the flight controls are deflected, so the control surfaces are deflected. It's all about pressure. So you steer the airplane by applying just that much pressure on the flight controls so that you obtain the desired result. So a feel of the airplane is very important, and that comes with experience. There's the feel on the controls, there is the sound of the air rushing by, the sound of the engine. All those things with increasing experience will get you a better feel for the actual airplane, or for the situation the airplane is in, so to speak. Okay, let's have a look at the cockpit again. We have the yoke or the stick controlling elevator and aileron. We have the rudder pedals on the ground, operated with your feet. And we have throttle and mixture controls. I'm not talking about those right now. Then you have, and on the top of the pedals, you also have the brakes, left and right wheel brakes. Now, when it comes to the yoke or the control stick, one thing is very important, and that's to only apply light pressure with your fingers, and also hold it only with your fingers. Don't grab it like this with a lot of force, because that way the very important sensitive feeling for the control is lost. It will make the airplane control much more difficult, and also, well, simply worse. You will not be able to control the airplane as effectively and smoothly if you grab the controls like this. This is something that often happens to beginners, of course, if you're anxious or stressed out or something. But it's also something that can happen to an experienced pilot if he has a lot of a situation, a lot of workload, that he might notice that his hands are kind of clenching the controls. This is something that shouldn't happen. So if it happens, then just remind yourself to let go, to relax, and only apply a little pressure with your fingers, because this makes it possible that you actually feel the aircraft, and that's one of the key concepts for smooth flying. Now, with the rudder pedals, you should always rest your feet comfortably on them, heels on the ground, and if you need to deflect the rudder, you push with the respective foot, and if you push one pedal, the other one will move towards you, so be prepared to relax the other foot. Here's again a quick overview of the cockpit controls that we have to actually deflect our control surfaces. I've called it secondary control surface or control before, but it's actually really important, and that's the trim. In most basic airplanes, you only have elevator trim, but in more advanced airplanes, you can also have aileron or rudder trim. In the Cessna 152, we only have elevator trim. We'll talk about it in a second, but the cockpit control looks like this. Often it's a trim wheel, and if you turn it down, you will actually trim the airplane nose up. And by actually rotating the wheel up, you'll trim the airplane nose down. Sometimes you also have an electric trim control. It's mostly some kind of rocker switch on top of the yoke or stick. Okay, let's talk about the elevator first. It's in the back, as we've said. In this example picture, we have a elevator that's deflected down. So in flight, this would actually make the tail go up and the nose of the airplane go down. I'm always talking now about well, normal upright flight, not any upside down flight. Now, and by deflecting the elevator, you're actually rotating the airplane, as I've said before, around the lateral axis that you can see in the image. Now let's talk about the trim for a second. Now the trim, on some airplanes like this, it's moving the entire elevator or the entire horizontal stabilizer. But on most aircraft, the trim is just a smaller control surface that's mounted on the elevator control surface itself. And what it does, it deflects. If you move the trim wheel, the small surface deflects, and the airflow going over the elevator then changes the neutral position of the elevator. Now, why is this so important? For example, let's say we would need to climb for 10 minutes. So I'll have to keep back pressure for 10 minutes, which is tiring, which is prone to inducing errors if you're distracted and let go a little bit and so on. So what you would do is you pull back and then you use the trim, and you trim nose up just until you don't need any pressure on the control wheel anymore. And then actually you can let go and the airplane will maintain its climb attitude. Makes it more easier to fly, more convenient, also makes it easier to actually fly the airplane very smoothly. Because if you get distracted or something and you let go of the controls, the airplane will still keep its approximate attitude. Actually, to be really exact, you're always trimming for a specific speed. So if it's trimmed, let's say for 80 knots, then it will continue this climb at 80 knots. If you would now pull the power out, for example, to idle, then of course it would stop climbing, but it would then go into descent with roughly 80 knots. So you're always trimming for speed. But for practical reasons, you're trimming to relieve you of the control forces. That's why trim is really important. Always keep your airplane in trim. Makes flying that more easier and also safer. Then let's talk about the rudder. It's the vertical control surface on the tailplane. As I've said before, it's rotating the airplane around its vertical axis. On the ground, you need the rudder pedals to steer the airplane with the nose wheel steering if you have one, and also if you're going faster, like during the takeoff roll, you use it also to steer the nose left or right. In flight, the rudder is used during turns. We'll talk about that in the turning lesson, but when you're creating bank, then in most airplanes you have adverse yaw, which means you also have to apply rudder in direction of the turn to really fly a coordinated turn, so you're not slipping or skidding. Then during flight you need the rudder to compensate for the propeller effects. We'll talk about it in the takeoff lesson, but on a propeller that's turning to the right, as seen from the pilot, there are a few forces that actually want to turn the plane to the left, so you need right rudder to compensate for that. Of course, you also need the rudder to keep control in a crosswind. For example, use it in a crosswind landing to actually align the airplane with the runway center line. Here you can see a trim surface, an elevator trim tab that I've talked about before. Now let's talk about the the ailerons and the flaps. Now the ailerons, you find them on the outside portion of the outboard portion of the wings. Here on this image, you see them just in the background of the image. They are used to rotate the airplane around its longitudinal axis. So you're actually creating bank. You're causing a bank angle. And this is used for turning the airplane. One wing creates more lift than the other. One wing will rise, the other will drop. Then you have the flaps, normally found on the inboard side of the wings. Now the flaps are there to increase lift, and but they also increase drag. So we use them to have slower takeoff and landing speeds, because with extended flaps you'll have the same lift at a lesser speed, so you can have a shorter landing distance and so on. That's why we normally use some kind of extended flap setting for landing. For takeoff, it depends. If the runway is long enough, in many airplanes you can take off with the flaps up. In some, according to the handbook, you have to extend the flaps in any case. If the runway is really short, you'll then need flaps, even if you would be theoretically allowed to leave them up for takeoff. But if you have a short field takeoff, so you're really performance limited, you need the flaps to shorten your landing or your takeoff roll. In the first steps, those flaps, let's say 10 degrees, they considerably increase lift and a little bit also increase the drag, but at the later flap settings, let's say 30 degrees, there's a lot of additional drag, so you have to be aware of that. Also be aware of the so-called ballooning effect. Now, if you're flying, let's say, straight and level, and then you extend the flaps, then you immediately have more lift, and if you do nothing, the airplane will start to climb, so the nose will go up. And if you don't react, then maybe in the end you're 50 or 100 feet higher than before. Of course, we don't want that, but it's something we can easily anticipate. So we know that if you are going to extend the flaps, the aircraft will start ballooning. So you can simply avoid that by, if you're extending the flaps, at the same time, right away apply some forward pressure on the stick or yoke, and this will keep the nose down. So always be prepared for that. If you extend the flaps, you will have ballooning. Now here again we have an overview of the different axes and the controls. Now one very important concept for flying smoothly and precisely is attitude flying. Two important angles or definitions for that are the pitch angle and the bank angle. The pitch angle is the angle between the longitudinal axis and the natural horizon, and the bank angle is the angle between the lateral axis and the natural horizon. You can see this pretty well on the images, on the image that's shown here. And if you want to fly straight and level, we'll talk about that in a respective lesson. You kind of have to develop, not only straight and level, of course, but generally, you have to develop a pictorial sense of the natural horizon. You're kind of taking a picture of the natural horizon as it references your airplane and your pitch or bank angle. You're kind of taking a picture, and this makes it easier to recognize a small deviations, because you have this picture, the natural horizon, and the nose of the airplane as a reference, and then you'll immediately notice when something changes in this picture. So for example, the nose starts to drop, you immediately see a change in this picture you've made of the natural horizon. And thereby you'll notice immediately that the nose is actually dropping, and you can immediately react by just adding a bit back pressure on the yoke or stick, and you will still keep your altitude nicely. And that's one of the key concepts for flying, I think, is this attitude flying. Be aware of your attitude, pitch, and bank angle, and if something changes, then you have to react right away. And that's why it's also important to have the airplane properly trimmed. And flying is so much easier if you apply quick corrections and small corrections. Because at some point, if you need big corrections, then this might become something like this. And this is not very beautiful. So as soon as you have a small deviation, you should react right away, and then you'll only need a very small correction, and this will make flying so much smoother. All right, so this concludes the briefing about the effects of flight controls. Now let's try all this out in the airplane. See you then.